First, I'd like to join my colleague from Cleveland Clinic, Adi Mehta, in thanking Dr. Makar and Sipla for putting this together and giving me the opportunity to come to India and participate. This is my first visit to India, and so far I may say it's been absolutely wonderful. The hospitality has been tremendous. The food has been tremendous and abundant, and so I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here. So my task in this talk is to address the question of metabolic syndrome and pre-diabetes, and this has been touched on in previous talks, but I'm going to look at it a little bit more detail. So here is a map of the United States of America. So why am I showing a map of the United States when I come to India? Because I think there's much more data concerning obesity and diabetes on an epidemiological basis in the United States than most other countries. And you can see that between 1990 and 2007, the amount of obesity in America has been really increasing. This increase actually didn't start in 1990. The start of this really takeoff of an obesity epidemic was in the 1970s. And it continues pretty much unabated at the moment. But you can see, if you look at the 2007 map, that almost a majority of states in the United States now have a rate of obesity of greater than 25% of the adult population. If we look at it on a more global scale, again you can see that America seems to be the market leader in obesity, but I can tell you that the rest of the world is doing its best to try and catch up. And you can see that there's this little area within the Middle East, which is really quite hot as well for obesity. Here is some interesting data from Japan, and the yellow line shows the increase in prevalence of obesity amongst Japanese school children. Not a population that we typically think of as being particularly obese, but it is certainly increasing. And you can see that it's not a perfect correlation, but in the red line you can see that as the obesity amongst adolescents is increasing, then the amount of type 2 diabetes being diagnosed amongst Japanese adolescents is also increasing. And then here is estimates of the prevalence of diabetes between the age of 20 and 79 in the year 2010. And you can see that, again, the darker the color, it means the more prevalent is type 2 diabetes. Or this is actually for all diabetes, but worldwide, about 95% of all diabetes is actually type 2 diabetes. And the great increase that we're seeing worldwide relates to type 2 diabetes rather than type 1 diabetes. So again, I would point out that the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, is actually the highest here. North America obviously features to a great extent, and you can see that India has quite a high prevalence as well. But the next slide shows the estimate of prevalence by the year 2030, and you can see that the map is getting darker. And then the next slide actually projects the increase in the number. So this is you see that North America almost disappears from this. So over the next 20 years, it is reckoned that there's not going to be a huge increase in the amount of obesity and type 2 diabetes seen within North America. But the areas which are going to see the greatest increase actually represent Africa and South Asia. So that means that this is going to be an increasingly prevalent problem here in India, a problem that's already become greatly prevalent in my lifetime, is going to become even more so over the next 20 years. Some statistics relating to the United States. It's reckoned that almost 11% of Americans age 20 and older will have some type of diabetes or pre-diabetes. As I've said before, type 2 diabetes is much more prevalent than type 1 diabetes. And an important thing to realize about type 2 diabetes is that patients generally have the condition or pre-diabetes for 9 to 12 years before they're actually diagnosed. So we're making the diagnosis at a time when people have already had the abnormality going on for a number of years. So it's no surprise then that morbidity and mortality tends to be so high. And diabetes actually does shorten people's lives, and it's estimated, I think a common figure that would be put out would be it would take about 10 years on average off someone's recognized lifespan, but the data support anything from 4 to 19 years of life shortening. And of course, it also takes a toll in terms of quality of life through the chronic diabetic complications. There is this inverse relationship between visceral fat and insulin action, which is shown on this slide. And then you can see the two MRI scans. The one in the upper left-hand corner shows someone who's of thin body stature with not too much body visceral fat, whereas the one in the lower right-hand corner shows a large amount of visceral fat. And as the visceral adipose tissue increases, then one's ability to dispose of glucose decreases. In other words, there is an inverse relation with insulin action. Sorry about that. So, I want to talk a little bit about diagnosing metabolic syndrome. This isn't difficult. You don't need fancy equipment to be able to diagnose metabolic syndrome. You need scales and tape measure or a stadiometer to measure height and weight and calculate the body mass index. Most important, you need a tape measure to measure waist circumference. Measure the fasting lipids. Look for high triglycerides and low HDL cholesterol. This is the hallmark dyslipidemia of metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. And you want to be able to measure the glucose, either fasting glucose or a glucose tolerance test using 75 grams of oral glucose. Let me say in passing here, one of the questions that we get asked quite frequently by people in family and internal family practice and internal medicine is, how do we measure insulin resistance? In fact, insulin resistance is a difficult thing to measure in very precise terms in an individual person if you want, a number in terms of glucose disposal and that. The gold standard for doing it is glucose and insulin clamping, which is a complicated, tedious, time-consuming